It was a quiet, cold evening in Montana. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light barely breaking through the thick clouds that gathered above. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the branches like a warning. It seemed to carry with it a whisper, a message lost in the cold night air. But if anyone listened closely, they might have heard the faintest echo of something else, something ancient and dark. The small town of Cedar Creek, nestled deep within the heart of Montana's wilderness, was known for its serenity. A quiet, almost forgotten place where the only sounds that could be heard were the rustling of leaves in the fall and the distant call of coyotes at night. The townspeople were simple folk, used to the isolation and cold winters, living in harmony with the land. But there was one thing that tied them all together, an unspoken secret that ran deep through their veins. They called it the Big Sky. The Big Sky wasn't just the vast stretch of land that could be seen from any hilltop or mountain peak, nor was it the majestic, endless horizon that seemed to go on forever. No. The Big Sky was something much more sinister. Something that the townspeople dared not speak of in the light of day. It was a curse. An ancient, unyielding curse that had haunted the land for centuries, long before the first settlers had arrived. It was said that the curse was born from the land itself, from the very earth that had soaked up the blood of the many who had disappeared without a trace. Strange things had happened in Cedar Creek, especially around the old trail that led deep into the forest, where the trees grew dense and twisted, blocking out the light. Some said the trail was where the curse had first begun, and others whispered that the trail still called to those foolish enough to wander into its depths. But no one dared talk about it openly. It wasn't something you could speak of in public, not in the town where people prided themselves on their hard work and simple lives. The townspeople would only whisper about the Big Sky when the wind howled too loudly, when the moon was hidden, and when the dark corners of the forest seemed to grow darker than usual. They spoke in hushed tones, eyes flicking nervously around, making sure no one was listening. And when they did speak of it, it was with a knowing look, a look that said, "You don't want to go there." It was in the eyes of the older folk who would sit on their porches in the evening, rocking slowly in their chairs, watching the shadows stretch longer into the night. You could see the fear in their eyes when someone would ask about the trail, about the legends, about the stories. Some said the ground of the Big Sky Trail was soaked in blood, a never-ending stain that could never be washed away. Blood from the countless victims who had walked the trail, only to disappear into the woods, never to be seen again. Some said they had been taken by the forest itself, Others whispered that it was the spirits of the lost who claimed the lives of the curious. The land of Cedar Creek had a strange way of holding on to its secrets. No one ever truly knew how many had vanished over the years, but the stories had been passed down, generation after generation. Each new story seemed to add more darkness, more fear to the growing legend. But one thing remained constant. No one ever returned from the Big Sky Trail. Jake, a curious teenager with a thirst for adventure, had always heard the stories growing up. He had heard the warnings, the whispers of the old folk who had spent their lives in Cedar Creek. He had heard the tales of strange happenings, of people who had vanished without a trace, of the terrifying, twisted trees that seemed to grow larger and more sinister as you ventured further into the trail. But like most kids, Jake thought they were just that. Stories. Tales that the older generation told to scare the younger ones, to keep them away from the places they didn't want them to go. Stories to stop the adventurous from seeking out the unknown. 4 years, he and his friends had dared each other to walk the haunted trail. They'd joke about it, laughing off the fear that crept into their voices whenever they'd talk about it. They'd take turns making excuses for why they shouldn't go. And then, one by one, they'd back out, not willing to be the one to face whatever it was that lingered in the forest. But tonight, Jake felt something different. Something was off. There was no laughter, no teasing, no excuses. Just a deep, gnawing feeling in his gut that he couldn't shake. The stories weren't funny anymore. His heart raced as he stood at the edge of the trail, staring into the dark woods beyond. It was almost as though the trees themselves were watching him, waiting for him to make the first move. The silence was thick, oppressive. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on him. Jake stood frozen at the entrance to the Big Sky Trail, the cold wind tugging at his jacket, pulling him further into the shadows. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was no one behind him, no one to call him back. His friends had all bailed. Some were too scared, some had their own reasons, but Jake knew what had to be done. Tonight wasn't about proving a point. It wasn't about daring each other to go further than the last. Tonight was about uncovering the truth. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry leaves that littered the forest floor. His flashlight flickered as he turned it on, casting a weak beam of light that barely illuminated the ground ahead. The trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted hands, blocking out most of the moonlight. The air grew colder with each step, and Jake could feel his breath coming in short bursts as he walked deeper into the forest. The trail was quiet. Too quiet. Not even the usual sounds of animals or insects filled the air. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Every step he took felt heavier, like the earth itself was trying to pull him back. Jake forced himself to keep walking, to move forward despite the dread that threatened to rise in his chest. He couldn't turn back now. Not after everything he had heard. Not after all the stories that had haunted him for years. He needed to know the truth. The deeper he went into the woods, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, and the trees grew thicker, their trunks twisted and bent, as though they had been shaped by some unseen force. The further he walked, the less the world outside the forest seemed to matter. There was only the dark, the silence, and the strange weight of the curse that seemed to hang in the air. And then, just as he was beginning to wonder if he was walking in circles, he heard it. A soft, distant whisper. It was faint at first, like the wind, but as he strained to listen, he realized that it was words. "Leave this place." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The voice was low, almost soothing, yet carried with it an unmistakable warning. He froze in place, eyes darting around, but the darkness was unbroken. No sign of anyone. No sign of anything. Yet he knew he was no longer alone. The air was thick with silence as Jake stepped onto the trail. The world around him felt unnaturally still, as if the entire forest had held its breath in anticipation. Each step he took seemed to deepen the quiet, as though the earth itself was absorbing every sound, swallowing them whole. The woods were suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides, and the further he walked, the heavier the atmosphere became. The trees towered above him, their twisted forms looming like ancient guardians, their dark bark marked with scars and strange ridges, as if the very life of the forest had been drained from them over the centuries. He felt small, insignificant, like a single thread woven into a vast, dark tapestry of age-old secrets. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, soft and damp, as if it had absorbed far more moisture than it should have. With each step, the earth seemed to shift slightly, a gentle pulse underfoot, like the forest itself was breathing, alive with something other than nature. It wasn't the kind of forest Jake was used to. Back in town, he'd walked through plenty of woods, but this one was different. There was a tension in the air, an energy that felt foreign. And with every step deeper into the trail, it felt as though something was watching him, tracking his every movement, waiting for him to make a mistake. Jake's flashlight was the only thing that cut through the oppressive darkness. Its weak beam barely illuminated the path ahead, flickering with each swing of his arm. The light seemed to retreat into the night, as if the darkness itself was eager to swallow it. The wind howled in the distance, rattling the branches above him, sending a shiver down his spine. It was like the sound of something, calling out. But what was it? Was it just the wind? Or was it something worse? He shook his head, trying to push away the nagging feeling creeping up on him. "It's just the forest," he muttered to himself, though the words didn't offer much comfort. He could almost feel the chill creeping in from all sides. The trees grew closer together the further he walked, their branches intertwining like the fingers of 1,000 hands, weaving together into a dense canopy overhead. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the deeper he went, the more the light from his flashlight seemed to fade into the surrounding darkness. It was as if the forest was swallowing everything around him, each step pulling him further from the safety of the town, further from reality. As he moved forward, he started to notice something odd, strange marks on the trees. At first, he thought they were just the usual scars left behind by animals or weather. But the more he looked, the more he realized they were something else entirely. Carved symbols, etched deeply into the bark, their shapes unfamiliar, foreign. They didn't look like anything Jake had ever seen before. They were intricate, looping patterns that seemed to have no meaning at all. They weren't just random scratches or graffiti from someone trying to mark their territory. These marks were old, ancient, almost ritualistic. His heartbeat quickened as he studied the symbols more closely, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Each symbol seemed to tell a story, one he couldn't understand, but felt in the pit of his stomach. The more he looked at them, the more unsettled he became, as if the trees themselves were speaking to him, urging him to turn back. But Jake was stubborn. He'd always been stubborn. And despite the unease gnawing at him, he told himself it was nothing. It was just nature, just the remnants of some long-forgotten time, nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, he knew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something far older, far darker, was watching him, waiting for him to go further. He shook it off, focusing on the path ahead. "Just keep walking," he whispered, more to himself than anything else. "Just keep moving forward." His footsteps echoed in the silence as he pressed on. The further he went, the more he noticed the absence of sound. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was as if the forest itself had gone mute, leaving only the hollow whisper of the wind to keep him company. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered, casting a brief shadow before the light went out entirely. He cursed under his breath, fumbling with the batteries. A small part of him wanted to turn back, to head home and forget this ever happened, but the curiosity was too strong. He had to know. With a grunt, he replaced the batteries and clicked the flashlight back on. The beam was dimmer now, but at least it worked. As he shined the light ahead, he caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. A figure. It was just a blur at first, a shape that seemed to float in the distance, barely visible in the murkiness of the woods. But as he stepped closer, the figure grew more defined. A tall man, standing motionless in the center of the trail. He was dressed in a long, dark coat, and his face was hidden in the shadows of his hood. The man didn't move, didn't make a sound. He was just standing there, as still as a statue. Jake's throat tightened. He felt a chill run down his spine as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he froze. Should he call out to the man? Or keep moving? The man's head slowly turned, and for the briefest of moments, their eyes met. But it wasn't the eyes Jake expected. They were empty, hollow, dark pits. No life, no soul, just darkness. The man's mouth twisted into something that almost resembled a smile, but it was wide, too wide, stretching across his face like something unnatural, something that didn't belong in this world. Jake's breath caught in his throat, and before he could react, the figure was gone. Vanished, as though the shadows themselves had swallowed him whole. The silence returned, but now it was deafening. His heart hammered in his chest, and his mind raced with thoughts he couldn't control. What was that? Who was that? Had it been real? A cold sweat broke out on Jake's forehead, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He took a shaky step back, his pulse racing, his eyes darting around the dark, empty woods. The wind whispered again, louder now, more insistent. "Get out." The whisper was faint, barely audible, but Jake heard it clearly. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was something else. Something alive. His entire body went rigid as the voice seemed to reach inside him, its cold fingers wrapping around his heart. It was a command, a warning, and Jake knew then that he couldn't ignore it. Something was wrong. Something ancient and terrifying was waiting in the darkness, and he had just stepped into its grasp. Jake's body went stiff,
as the voice echoed in the thick, heavy air. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was right behind him, a voice, clear, commanding, "Get out." His pulse raced, his heart thudding loudly in his chest. His breath came in quick gasps, panic gripping him like an iron fist. He wasn't alone. He wasn't imagining it. The voice had been real. It was real.
His head whipped around, eyes scanning the trail behind him, but there was nothing. No shadow, no movement, just the same quiet, eerie forest. The trees were unnervingly still, their dark silhouettes looming like silent sentinels in the night. The faint glow of his flashlight barely touched the earth beneath his feet, and the deep darkness seemed to stretch on forever. Jake's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to move. He picked up his pace, his feet scrambling through the underbrush, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The wind had picked up again, making the branches above him sway and creak. But it did nothing to calm his nerves. The silence that followed him felt suffocating, pressing down on him from all sides. It was too quiet, too still. He was walking deeper into the forest now, further than he had ever dared before. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. But it was one thing to hear about something, to hear the old-timers whispering about the cursed trail, the bloodstains, the disappearances. It was another thing to feel it, to experience it firsthand. Jake had always assumed it was just the locals' way of keeping kids like him from straying too far from home. But now he wasn't so sure. The trees around him were beginning to close in, their branches reaching out like long, gnarled fingers. The trail, once wide and open, seemed to shrink with every step. The forest felt claustrophobic now, as if the woods were alive, tightening around him, pushing him towards something he couldn't see, something that was waiting. His eyes darted from one side of the trail to the other, scanning every shadow, every flicker in the corner of his vision. But there was nothing. Not yet. And then, suddenly, there it was. A figure in the distance. At first, Jake thought it was just a trick of his tired eyes. A shadow cast by the trees. But as he focused, as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized that it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a person, a man. Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. The man was standing motionless in the middle of the trail, as still as the trees around him. The forest had become unnervingly silent again, the wind gone, leaving only the sound of Jake's own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The man's shape was barely distinguishable in the shadows, but there was something about him that felt wrong, something off.
Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. He took a tentative step forward, calling out to the man. "Hey, are you all right?" His voice cracked slightly, too loud in the oppressive silence. The words seemed to hang in the air, fading before they could even reach the man. But the figure didn't move. He just stood there, his body cloaked in shadow, his face hidden by the dark hood pulled over his head. The figure was unnervingly still, like a statue carved from stone, completely unmoving. Yet Jake could feel his presence, like a heavy weight pressing down on the trail. A chill ran down Jake's spine. He felt his legs grow heavier, his body urging him to turn around, to leave, to go back the way he came. But something in the back of his mind, something darker, made him take another step. He had to know who or what this was. He had to confront it. The stories, the whispers in town, they'd all been for nothing if he didn't get to the bottom of this. He wasn't going to be one of the stories, not if he could help it.
Jake moved closer, his feet dragging, his breath shallow. The figure didn't respond to his presence, still standing completely motionless. As Jake approached, he noticed something strange. The man's clothes were tattered, worn, as though they had been torn and mended countless times over the years. His movements, or lack thereof, didn't make sense. The longer Jake looked at him, the more he felt something was terribly wrong. The figure's presence seemed unnatural, like it didn't belong in the world Jake knew. When Jake was just a few feet away, something shifted. The figure turned, slowly, inhumanly slowly. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the man's head turned to face him. At first, it was just the hollow, empty blackness of the man's face that sent a wave of icy fear through Jake. But as his gaze traveled downward, he saw it. The smile. The man's mouth stretched unnaturally wide. The grin impossible, grotesque. It wasn't a smile of happiness, not even one of wicked amusement. It was a twisted, terrifying thing that seemed to split the man's face in half. The darkness of his mouth seemed to engulf everything around it, a cavernous, unending abyss. The smile reached from ear to ear, its edges curving in sharp, unnatural angles. The sight of it made Jake's stomach churn, and every muscle in his body screamed at him to run. But he couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the ground, his body frozen in place as he locked eyes with the figure. His mind screamed at him to look away, to break the connection, but it was too late. He could see it now, deep in the man's eyes, empty, hollow, and devoid of life. There was nothing human about it, just an empty blackness, the void of something lost, something that shouldn't exist. Without thinking, without even registering his actions, Jake bolted. His legs moved before his mind could catch up. He didn't care where he was going, didn't care about anything except getting away. The trail that had seemed so long before now felt like a lifeline, a fragile escape from whatever dark force had manifested in front of him. He didn't look back. The trees rushed by him, the underbrush scraping at his legs. But Jake didn't stop. The man, the thing, was still behind him, in the shadows. But Jake couldn't risk looking. He couldn't risk seeing that grin again. That horrifying, twisted thing that had haunted him since the moment he saw it. Jake's breath came in short, panicked gasps, his heart racing. He could hear the sound of something following him now, but it wasn't footsteps. It was too quiet for that. It was more like a shifting, a dragging noise, something scraping against the ground, moving just behind him. But when he dared to glance over his shoulder, there was nothing. Just the same empty darkness. The trees ahead of him seemed to stretch farther away. The trail never ending, twisting, winding, like it was trying to keep him there, to trap him. Jake pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his legs, ignoring the cold sweat dripping down his back. His only goal was to get out, to escape whatever it was that had followed him into this cursed place. Finally, with one last desperate push, he broke through the line of trees and into the clearing. The moonlight hit his face, and he gasped for air, blinking against the sudden brightness. But as he looked around, all he saw was the empty trail stretching out before him, silent once more. There was no figure, no man, just the eerie stillness of the forest. Jake collapsed to the ground, his body shaking, his heart still pounding in his chest. His eyes darted to every shadow, every movement in the night. But there was nothing. The forest was quiet once more. But Jake knew better now. Whatever he had seen, whatever had followed him, was still out there, waiting, watching, and it was far from over. Jake didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the trail. His legs burned with exhaustion, and his breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. He stumbled, barely able to keep his footing, as he pushed himself beyond his limits. The trees, the shadows, the eerie quiet of the forest, it all seemed to melt away the further he ran. But it never fully left him. His mind was still caught in the grip of terror, his pulse still racing as he tried to shake the images of the man from his thoughts. He dared to glance behind him as he reached the edge of the trail, expecting to see the figure, still following, still looming behind him. But there was nothing. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The stillness was unnerving, more unsettling than the horrors he had just run from. The dark trees stood tall and unmoving, their twisted branches stretching out like the skeletal arms of forgotten giants. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its cold, silver light across the clearing. But even that felt distant, detached, There was no sign of the man, no movement in the shadows. Jake collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, his body shaking uncontrollably. He dug his fingers into the dirt, trying to ground himself, but it was as if the earth beneath him no longer felt familiar. The soft, damp soil felt cold and foreign. The sweat that poured from his body in rivulets was now turning to chills. His heart raced in his chest, pounding so loud he could hear it in his ears. It wasn't the physical exhaustion that made him shake, though. It was the overwhelming, suffocating fear that still clung to him like a second skin. He had run. He had escaped. But he knew, deep down, that he hadn't truly gotten away. The darkness of the forest still haunted him. The twisted grin of the man, that wide, grotesque smile, still lingered in his mind. He could see it clearly now, like an indelible stain burned into his memory. The man's eyes, empty, hollow, black pits, seemed to follow him everywhere he went, even as he sat there in the clearing, trying to steady his breath. Jake felt a cold, nagging fear at the pit of his stomach. It wasn't over. Whatever had happened in the woods, whatever he had seen, it wasn't done with him. The truth was starting to hit him, and it was a truth he wasn't ready to face. This wasn't just a legend, the stories people told about Big Sky, the warnings, the whispers of the cursed trail. They were real. There was something dark, something dangerous, lurking in those woods. The bloodstains weren't just tales passed down over generations. They weren't just something to scare children or keep them away from the forest. They were real, and Jake had just stepped into it. The walk back to town was a blur. His legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last. The trees seemed to press in on him, their shapes shifting in the corner of his vision, and he had the distinct feeling that the forest was alive, watching him, waiting for him to return. As he walked through the quiet streets of Cedar Creek, he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at his mind. It felt like the whole town was holding its breath. The silence, more oppressive than ever before. The familiar sights of home, the warm glow of streetlights, the quiet houses lined up in neat rows, all of it felt distant now, foreign, like he didn't belong. The next day, Jake met with his friends. He tried to act normal, tried to brush off the terror that had consumed him the night before. But the image of the man's twisted grin haunted him, and he couldn't bring himself to look at his friends without feeling like they were all in danger. He had to warn them. They had to know. They had to believe him. But when Jake started talking, when he told them what had happened, they just laughed. They called him crazy, a fool for wandering that deep into the woods, and brushed off his story like it was some childish prank. His friend Ben slapped him on the back and joked, "Man, you're just trying to scare us. It's just a bunch of old stories. There's no man out there. Just the forest messing with your head." But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The way they laughed, the way they dismissed him, it was like they didn't really believe. Or worse, like they didn't understand. And Jake realized that it wasn't just about the forest. It was about something far darker. Something that had lived in these woods for far too long. The curse of Big Sky wasn't just a story, a tale told to frighten the children. It was a truth, and the moment he had stepped onto that cursed trail, he had crossed into a world that didn't make sense. A world where the dead could speak, where the living were nothing more than prey. The truth was slowly unraveling, and Jake could feel it tightening around him. It wasn't just a legend. It was something that had been waiting, watching, waiting for someone like him to come along. Someone who was foolish enough to challenge it. Later that night, as Jake lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it all crashed down on him. The quiet hum of the night outside was deafening. The wind whistled through the cracks in the windows, a distant echo in the stillness. He thought about what he had seen, about the man, about the emptiness in his eyes, the twisted grin that seemed to stretch beyond reason. That thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for him, waiting for someone who was curious enough to come close. Jake turned on his side, trying to escape the constant buzz of fear in his head. But it was no use. The images wouldn't leave him. He closed his eyes, but all he could see was that empty smile, that hollow stare, that terrible, unyielding presence. The fear clung to him like a dark cloud, hanging over his every thought. He couldn't shake it. He couldn't outrun it. And worst of all, he knew, deep down, that his friends, Ben, Maria, and the others, were next. They hadn't believed him. They hadn't seen it. They hadn't felt it. But they would. They would soon enough. Jake sat up in bed, his hands trembling as he reached for his phone. He needed to warn them. He needed to make them understand. He typed out a message to Ben, but when he read it back, the words seemed weak. There was no way he could make them understand, not the way things were now. They'd just laugh again, or worse, brush him off as being crazy. The curse of Big Sky had already started to unfold, and Jake knew that it was only a matter of time before it came for them all. The bloodstains in the forest weren't just stains on the ground. They were warnings, and Jake was starting to realize that there was no escaping it. The darkness of the forest was calling, and it would not stop until it claimed every last one of them. The days that followed Jake's encounter in the forest were a blur. At first, it seemed like things might return to normal. The sun rose each morning with the same warmth. The town went about its business, and the noise of life crept back into Cedar Creek. But Jake knew better. He could feel it, lurking in the corners of his mind, a persistent gnawing at the edge of his thoughts, like an itch that couldn't be scratched. It started small, a sensation of being watched. He would be walking through town or sitting at the diner, and he would suddenly look over his shoulder, convinced that something was following him. The feeling would fade as quickly as it came, but it never went away completely. It was always there, just beneath the surface, like the echo of footsteps in a quiet hallway. And then, in the dead of night, it got worse. Strange noises began to haunt him. At first, they were subtle. A soft rustling outside his window when there was no wind. The faintest whisper in the darkness, too distant to understand, but close enough to send chills down his spine. Jake would lie awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, straining his ears, listening to every creak of the house, every rustle in the trees. But it was always the same. The whisper would come, and then the silence would return, as though the night itself was holding its breath. Then, the footsteps started. At first, it was nothing but a faint sound, like someone walking through the hallway of his house. It was so faint, so indistinct, that Jake chalked it up to his imagination. But over time, it grew louder. He would hear them as he lay in bed. The soft pad of footsteps, moving closer and closer, until it felt like someone was standing right outside his door. When he would get up to investigate, there would be nothing there, just the eerie stillness of the house, as if the world itself had frozen in place. Jake began to lose sleep. His mind was consumed with thoughts of the man he had seen in the woods. The twisted grin, the hollow eyes, the way the figure had appeared out of nowhere, as if the shadows themselves had come to life. He couldn't shake it. It replayed in his mind like a broken record, the image of the man growing more vivid with each passing day. And it wasn't just the image that haunted him. It was the feeling that the curse was following him, that it wasn't over. The man in the woods wasn't just a figment of his imagination, and the forest wasn't just a place to avoid. The curse of Big Sky was real, and it had latched onto Jake. It was only a matter of time before it came for him again. But what was he supposed to do? He had already run once. He had tried to leave, tried to outrun the terror, but it hadn't worked. It had followed him home. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted, stalked by something far beyond his understanding. No matter how fast he ran, it was always one step behind. And then, things started to happen in his own house. It started with small, almost insignificant things. Marks on the walls. Symbols. Symbols that Jake recognized from the trail. The same strange, intricate carvings he had seen etched into the trees. They appeared on the walls of his bedroom, at first just one or two, but then more. Spreading across the walls, creeping like vines, twisting their way around the room. At first, Jake tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the light, or that it was nothing more than the result of his stressed mind. But as the symbols grew, as they began to crawl further into his home, he knew it was real. The curse was real, and it was coming for him. One night, after the symbols had appeared again, Jake stood in front of his bathroom mirror, wiping the sleep from his eyes. He was exhausted, his mind a tangled mess of fear and uncertainty. He was barely holding it together, but as he looked into the mirror, his blood turned to ice. He saw him, the man, standing behind him. Jake's breath caught in his throat. His body went cold, and his legs felt like they might give way beneath him. His reflection was just as it should be, pale and tired, the wear of sleepless nights etched into his face. But the figure behind him, that wasn't supposed to be there. The man's grin was even wider than before. His teeth were sharp, jagged, and the smile stretched unnaturally across his face. It was no longer a smile of curiosity or malice. It was something else. A twisted mockery of a smile, as if the man were enjoying Jake's fear. The man's eyes were hollow, nothing but darkness. The reflection wasn't right. The way the figure stood, it was almost as if it was too still, too perfect in its wrongness. Jake blinked, his heart pounding in his chest. But when he opened his eyes again, the man was gone. The room was empty. The reflection was his own. Jake stumbled back, his legs shaking beneath him as he backed away from the mirror. His mind was racing, his thoughts colliding with one another in a chaotic mess. He couldn't understand it. How was this happening? He'd seen the man before, but this was different. This wasn't just a memory. This wasn't a shadow or a figment of his imagination. This was something real, something that could reach him wherever he was. The curse of Big Sky had followed him home, and it wasn't going to stop. Jake couldn't take it anymore. He was losing his mind, and he knew it. The walls were closing in around him. The footsteps, the whispers, the symbols, they were all a part of it. A part of something bigger, something he couldn't fight, no matter how hard he tried. He had to return to the trail. He had to confront whatever it was that had been haunting him. If he didn't, it would keep coming for him. It would never stop.
The darkness would keep creeping in until there was nothing left. Jake couldn't let that happen. He had to end it. He had to go back to Big Sky. Face whatever curse lay in those woods and put an end to it once and for all. He didn't know how or what he would find when he returned, but he knew he couldn't live like this anymore. The curse was real, and it was following him. And unless he confronted it, it would consume him whole. There was no other choice. He had to go back. The night was colder than ever when Jake set foot on the trail once more. A chill in the air bit through his jacket, sinking into his bones. He had come back, and this time he wasn't running away. He wasn't going to let whatever had tormented him for so long continue to haunt him. Tonight, he would face it. Tonight, he would end it.
He had walked this path before, but now it felt different, darker, heavier. The air was thick with an unsettling weight, and with each step, it felt like the forest was pressing in on him. The trees, which had once seemed so innocuous, now felt alive, their gnarled branches twisting toward him like fingers reaching out from the shadows. They seemed to watch him, their dark forms whispering to one another in the wind, the sound almost like voices. It was as if the woods themselves were aware of his presence, waiting for him to move deeper into their heart. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had never felt the forest like this before. Every snap of a twig under his feet, every rustling of leaves above his head felt louder, more pronounced, as if the forest was listening, reacting to his every movement. The trees that had once seemed like harmless sentinels now felt like predators. There was no turning back. There was no safety. Only the path ahead, winding through the oppressive darkness, beckoning him to continue. He pressed on, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cold wind picked up, but there was something off about it. It wasn't just the wind. It was as if the very air was alive with a sense of foreboding. It tugged at him, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The whispering, the sense of being watched, grew stronger with every passing moment. But Jake kept his eyes forward, his jaw clenched tight, his resolve unwavering. He had come here for one reason. And that reason was to face whatever had been haunting him since that night in the woods. As he ventured further into the heart of the forest, the trail seemed to narrow, the trees crowding closer together. The darkness around him deepened, swallowing the light from his flashlight, making the forest feel like an endless abyss. His pulse quickened, the fear creeping back into his chest, but he forced it down. He couldn't afford to be afraid. Not now. Not when he was so close. And then, just as his anxiety was reaching its peak, he saw it. There, standing at the end of the trail, in the same spot where he had seen the figure before, was the shape, the man,
Or at least, Jake thought it was a man at first. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, the figure became clearer. But this time, it wasn't just a man. It was something far worse. Something twisted. Something unnatural. The thing that stood before him was no longer human. Not in any way that Jake could comprehend. Its form was warped and deformed. Its body covered in long, ragged scars, as if it had been torn apart and put back together 1,000 times. Its limbs were too long, too thin, bent at unnatural angles. It was like a broken puppet, a creature stitched together from nightmares.
The thing's face was the worst part. Where a human face should have been, there was only a blank, hollow visage. Its eyes were deep, black voids, like two gaping holes in the darkness. There was no soul in them, only emptiness. But the worst part was its mouth. It grinned, impossibly wide, a grotesque smile that stretched far beyond what a human mouth could ever do. Its teeth were jagged and sharp, rows of them, like the teeth of some monstrous predator. The smile seemed to consume its face, spreading to unnatural proportions. Jake froze. The creature's grin widened, its mouth stretching even further as it took a step toward him. "You should have stayed away," it whispered, its voice barely more than a rasping hiss. But it pierced through Jake's chest like a physical blow. Jake's blood ran cold, but something inside him snapped. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. He had come here to face it, and now there was no going back. With a cry that came from deep within his soul, Jake lunged at the creature. Every muscle in his body burned with the effort, every fiber of his being pushing him forward. He reached out, his hands aimed straight for the creature. But before he could make contact, the thing simply vanished. 1 second, it was there, standing before him, grinning that horrid grin. The next, it was gone. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he stumbled forward, his arms flailing for something to hold on to, but the forest was empty. The creature had disappeared into the air, vanishing like smoke. There was no sign of it, no trace, no sound. Jake's mind raced. He stood there, frozen in the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. The trail before him was empty, the forest silent once again. Had it been real? Had he imagined it? No. He had seen it with his own eyes. It had been real. The creature had been real. And then he saw it. A streak of red across the ground. A thin, almost imperceptible trail of blood. It was the only thing left behind. The creature hadn't just disappeared. It had left something behind. A mark. Proof that it had been there. The blood was fresh. Jake's breath hitched as he followed the trail, his heart pounding in his chest. It led deeper into the forest, into the shadows. The blood was thick, darker now, almost black in the dim light. It wasn't just a few drops. It was a steady stream, as though the creature had bled out in its wake. The blood soaked into the ground, staining the earth, leaving a trail that was impossible to ignore. Jake knew what he had to do. He had to follow it. He had to find the creature, or whatever it was, and end it. But the deeper he went into the woods, the heavier the air became, the more oppressive the silence felt. It was as if the forest was closing in around him, the trees pressing closer, the darkness swallowing him whole. And then, just as he thought he might collapse under the weight of it all, he heard something. A sound, barely a whisper at first, but it grew louder, clearer. A voice. "You can't stop it," it said. The voice was soft, distant, but it was unmistakable. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. He whipped around, searching the forest, but there was no one there. The blood was still there, leading him deeper into the heart of the darkness. Jake had to continue. He had to face whatever was waiting for him. The curse of Big Sky wasn't over, and he knew it would never be over. The darkness would never stop, and it would always be waiting for the next person foolish enough to walk its cursed path.